There are moments in international politics when you don't need classified intelligence to sense the tension. Sometimes, all it takes is a glance at the faces standing behind the podium. President Donald Trump's latest appearance at the NATO summit was one of those moments. Trump walked onto the stage flanked by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and Senior Advisor Stephen Miller. What immediately caught the eye wasn't the lineup itself. It was their expressions. Rubio appeared unusually tense. Hegseth looked less like a defense chief preparing for a successful press conference and more like a commander bracing for impact. Trump himself projected visible fatigue after a day dominated by a series of controversial remarks. But the real story wasn't unfolding inside the NATO conference hall. The far more consequential developments were taking place thousands of miles away in the Middle East, where the risk of military escalation appears to be rising by the hour. Following U.S. airstrikes against Iranian targets, the strategic atmosphere has shifted dramatically. Whatever restraint may have existed before now seems increasingly fragile, as both Washington and Tehran adopt noticeably harder public positions. Trump has continued to signal that the United States is prepared to expand military operations if Iran continues challenging American interests. Yet, from a military planning perspective, that's not a decision driven by political rhetoric alone. Modern wars are not won by speeches. They are won by missile inventories, logistics networks, industrial capacity, and the ability to sustain high-intensity combat operations month after month. According to numerous strategic assessments, recent operations have consumed significant numbers of precision-guided munitions, interceptor missiles, and other advanced weapons systems. These are not assets that can simply be replenished in a matter of weeks. America's defense industrial base remains powerful, but rebuilding stockpiles of sophisticated munitions is measured in months, and in some cases, years. In other words, the United States still possesses overwhelming military superiority. However, opening another large-scale conflict would place substantial pressure on its strategic reserves and defense production pipeline. That helps explain why the Trump administration has been seeking additional congressional funding to replenish missile stockpiles. This isn't merely a budget debate. It reflects a broader reality that has become increasingly evident in modern warfare. Today's battlefields consume advanced weapons at a pace that often outstrips even the world's largest defense industries. Meanwhile, another development has drawn considerable attention from defense analysts. The Boeing 747 gifted by Qatar had once been portrayed as a symbol of the close relationship between Doha and Washington. Before entering service, the aircraft reportedly underwent extensive security modifications, costing hundreds of millions of dollars, including comprehensive electronic inspections, counter-surveillance measures, and upgrades designed to meet the stringent security standards required for transporting the President of the United States. Yet Trump unexpectedly chose to return to the older Air Force One. The decision immediately fueled speculation. One reporter directly asked whether the switch had anything to do with heightened security concerns following the escalation with Iran. From a national security standpoint, that was an entirely reasonable question. In modern conflict, a head-of-state aircraft ranks among the highest-value intelligence targets on the planet. Even the slightest suspicion of electronic surveillance, cyber compromise, or exploitable vulnerabilities can be enough for security agencies to recommend the safest available option rather than accept unnecessary risk. If security considerations did influence the decision, and no official confirmation has been provided, it would represent far more than a simple change of aircraft. It could suggest that policymakers in Washington are evaluating the current threat environment as significantly more serious than what has been disclosed publicly. During his remarks, President Donald Trump once again adopted an unusually hard line toward Iran. He made it clear that he no longer sees much value in continuing negotiations, arguing that Iranian leaders repeatedly walk away from agreements the moment the cameras start rolling. According to Trump, both sides may reach an understanding behind closed doors, but once Iranian officials step in front of the media, they publicly deny the very commitments they had just discussed. From a diplomatic perspective, this reflects a familiar reality. International negotiations are never confined to the conference table. They also unfold before television cameras, domestic audiences, financial markets, and allied governments. Every participant is constantly trying to maximize leverage, preserving as many bargaining chips as possible for the next round of talks. To put it a little more humorously, diplomacy often resembles a high-stakes chess match, except neither player admits making a move until they're convinced they can still win the game. Many strategic analysts have long argued that Iran's negotiating approach is built around buying time while steadily increasing pressure in hopes of extracting additional concessions from Washington. Whether one agrees with that assessment or not, it is clear that many American policymakers have grown increasingly frustrated with the pace and direction of the negotiations. Meanwhile, the rhetoric coming from Tehran has become noticeably more confrontational. According to multiple reports, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has signaled that what it describes as the era of restraint is over, while issuing warnings directed at several Gulf states, including Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. That dramatically complicates Washington's strategic calculations. Most of these countries are either long-standing American security partners or host critical U.S. military installations. Should any of them become targets in a broader regional conflict, the United States would face enormous pressure to honor its security commitments and respond accordingly. This is precisely the scenario military planners have spent decades trying to avoid: a localized confrontation gradually expanding into a chain reaction of alliance obligations that pulls more and more nations into the conflict. Developments at sea are also drawing growing attention. A recently circulated radio transmission from the Strait of Hormuz reportedly captured the distress call of a liquefied natural gas carrier transporting hazardous cargo before communications were abruptly interrupted. The circumstances surrounding the transmission remain unclear, but the incident has added to concerns about the security of one of the world's most strategically important maritime corridors. If commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz were to face sustained disruption, the consequences would extend far beyond the Middle East. Roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through this narrow waterway. Even a temporary interruption could trigger sharp reactions across global energy markets, driving up insurance costs, increasing shipping risks, and putting renewed pressure on oil prices worldwide. Back at the NATO summit, however, Trump maintained that the trip had been an overwhelming success, proudly describing the members of his team as superstars. Politics, of course, always leaves room for optimism. The interesting part is that, on many occasions, the expressions of those standing behind the speaker reveal a far more compelling story than the speech itself. And in both diplomacy and military affairs, professionals have long understood one simple principle: actions usually carry far more weight than words. When a head of state unexpectedly changes presidential aircraft during a period of escalating regional tensions, experienced analysts rarely dismiss it as mere coincidence. Instead, they treat it as a signal, one that deserves careful examination rather than immediate conclusions. Trump's latest appearance at the NATO summit has quickly ignited debate extending well beyond the president's personal security. The broader question now being asked is whether Washington is responding to strategic warning signs that have not yet been fully disclosed to the public. Among the first to question the administration's explanation was former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. McFaul expressed skepticism over Trump's explanation for declining to use the Boeing 747 that had been provided by Qatar. According to McFaul, the suggestion that the aircraft was simply being flown to Europe so American service members could admire it in person was difficult to accept at face value. He argued that the public would likely learn the real reasons behind the unusual decision in due course. That skepticism echoed a question raised during the press conference by New York Post reporter Stephen Nelson. Nelson asked directly whether Trump's decision to abandon the newly modified presidential aircraft was connected to concerns over a possible Iranian assassination threat, particularly given Trump's own repeated statements that Tehran considers him a high-value target. Rather than answering the question directly, Trump responded in his signature style. He remarked that being president of the United States is among the most dangerous jobs in the world, joking that it is even riskier than professional auto racing or riding bulls in a rodeo. Trump went on to claim that an American president faces roughly a 5.2% chance of dying while in office, adding that had he known those odds years ago, he might never have entered politics in the first place. Whether or not that specific figure is supported by historical statistics, the broader message was unmistakable. Trump was signaling that the White House continues to view threats against the president as genuine and serious, particularly against the backdrop of escalating tensions with Iran. As Trump continued speaking, however, the officials standing behind him gradually became part of the story themselves. Secretary of State Marco Rubio maintained an awkward smile, almost as if he were trying to anticipate where the president's remarks were headed next. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood motionless, his expression unusually tense, while Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent remained characteristically unreadable. If this had been a political satire, viewers might have assumed the reactions were scripted for comic effect. Instead, during what was supposed to be a routine press conference, those unscripted expressions became an unexpected subplot. Trump then returned to a subject he has mentioned on numerous occasions. He reiterated that he believes he remains one of Iran's primary assassination targets, joking that he would much rather be number one on TikTok than at the top of Tehran's target list. Behind the humor, however, lies a serious national security issue. Following the U.S. strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020, senior Iranian officials repeatedly vowed that those responsible would eventually face retaliation. For years, American security agencies have maintained exceptionally high levels of protection around Trump because of those publicly stated threats. As a result, when the president raises the issue again during a major international summit, analysts naturally begin asking whether new intelligence assessments may have prompted additional security precautions. That context made the next exchange with reporters even more intriguing. When another journalist asked why he had chosen not to fly aboard the newly refurbished Air Force One, Trump's answer surprised many observers. According to the president, the aircraft would instead travel to several major U.S. military bases across Europe, so that American service members could have the opportunity to see what he described as a beautiful airplane. He added that he would simply return home aboard the standard presidential aircraft. It was an answer that immediately generated more questions than it resolved. From the standpoint of presidential security and military operations, an aircraft serving as Air Force One is not a traveling exhibit designed for public display. Every presidential flight involves an extraordinarily complex security operation, integrating intelligence agencies, the U.S. Air Force, electronic warfare specialists, communications security teams, and multiple layers of classified protective measures. For that reason, many defense observers found it difficult to accept that changing the president's aircraft would be motivated solely by a desire to showcase it to American troops. That does not automatically imply the existence of some hidden operation or undisclosed crisis. It does, however, leave room for legitimate questions about whether additional technical, security, diplomatic, or operational considerations may have influenced the decision without being discussed publicly. Trump then shifted his attention to domestic politics, criticizing former President Joe Biden. He argued that America's adversaries had once viewed the United States as weak because, in his words, the previous president struggled to communicate effectively and project strength on the world stage. According to Trump, America's allies and competitors alike now respect Washington once again under his leadership. Ironically, though, the NATO trip produced several viral moments of its own. One widely circulated video appeared to show Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan gently guiding Trump back onto the correct section of the ceremonial red carpet. Within hours, social media users transformed the clip into countless memes, joking that there was only one direction to walk and he still needed directions. Another moment quickly attracted attention when Trump appeared to mistakenly refer to the Islamic Republic of Japan instead of Iran while discussing missile attacks. The verbal slip lasted only seconds, but that was more than enough to fuel another wave of online commentary. The awkward moments did not end there. During a conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Trump accidentally asked whether Zelensky had any questions for President Putin before immediately correcting himself. While the remark was almost certainly an unintended verbal mistake, every word spoken by world leaders carries unusual political weight, especially while Russia's war against Ukraine continues. Zelensky, for his part, responded with the dry humor that has often characterized his public appearances. When Trump asked whether he wanted to visit Moscow, the Ukrainian president smiled and replied that doing so would be rather difficult because there were too many Ukrainian drones in the sky. The room erupted in laughter. Yet beneath the joke was a carefully crafted strategic message. Zelensky was subtly reinforcing the image of Ukraine as a nation that remains confident in its ability to project military power despite the prolonged conflict. Despite the lighter moments, the central issue of the press conference remained Iran. Trump once again declared that Iran would never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon, emphasizing that the United States was prepared to use military force if necessary to prevent that outcome. Strategically speaking, this was not a new policy. For decades, preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapons capability has remained one of the core objectives of successive American administrations, regardless of political party. The challenge facing Washington today is considerably more complicated. The United States must maintain enough military pressure to convince Tehran that pursuing nuclear weapons would carry unacceptable costs, while simultaneously avoiding the kind of regional escalation that could evolve into a prolonged, multi-front conflict stretching across the Middle East. That balancing act is becoming increasingly difficult. Every additional deployment, every military exercise, every naval movement, and every presidential statement now sends signals that are scrutinized not only in Tehran, but also in Moscow, Beijing, Jerusalem, Riyadh, and capitals across Europe. In today's geopolitical environment, strategic messaging has become almost as important as military capability itself. And when signals begin to multiply simultaneously, from changes in presidential travel to heightened security discussions to increasingly forceful rhetoric on both sides, experienced analysts rarely focus on any single event in isolation. Instead, they step back and examine the broader strategic picture, searching for the pattern that connects them all.
Viewed individually, none of these developments necessarily points to an imminent military confrontation. Taken together, however, they paint the picture of an increasingly volatile strategic environment. Washington is attempting to project strength without becoming trapped in another prolonged Middle Eastern war. Tehran is trying to demonstrate resilience without crossing the threshold that could trigger an overwhelming American military response. Meanwhile, America's regional allies are quietly preparing for contingencies they hope will never materialize. This is the defining characteristic of modern deterrence. Military power is no longer measured solely by the number of aircraft carriers at sea or fighter squadrons in the air. It is equally measured by perception, credibility, logistics, intelligence, and the ability to convince an adversary that escalation would ultimately be self-defeating. That is why seemingly routine decisions often attract extraordinary attention. A change in presidential transportation, an unusually cautious security posture, a carefully worded statement from a military spokesman, or even the facial expressions of senior officials standing silently behind the commander-in-chief. None of these events proves that a major military operation is imminent, but together they form a pattern that professional analysts cannot afford to ignore. Strategic warning signs rarely arrive all at once. More often, they emerge gradually, one decision, one deployment, one diplomatic signal at a time. Only in hindsight do those scattered pieces begin to resemble a coherent picture. That is precisely why intelligence professionals spend so much time analyzing what appears ordinary. The most significant developments in international security are often hidden in plain sight. Whether Trump's decision regarding Air Force One was driven by operational security, technical considerations, diplomatic calculations, or simply personal preference has not been publicly confirmed. Likewise, speculation surrounding the administration's internal threat assessments remains just that, speculation unless supported by official evidence. Even so, the questions themselves are revealing. They illustrate how every presidential decision is now being viewed through the lens of a rapidly evolving confrontation between Washington and Tehran. And perhaps that is the broader lesson emerging from this NATO summit. The headlines may focus on speeches, political exchanges, or moments that go viral online. Strategists, however, tend to pay closer attention to something else entirely. They watch the decisions that are made behind the scenes. They observe how military resources are positioned. They study shifts in security procedures. They evaluate the consistency or inconsistency between public messaging and operational behavior. Because in geopolitics, actions frequently communicate what official statements deliberately leave unsaid. As tensions continue to rise across the Middle East, the real question is no longer whether both sides are engaged in strategic signaling. They clearly are. The more important question is whether those signals are still serving to deter conflict, or whether they are gradually pushing both sides toward a crisis that neither truly intends to fight. History has shown that major wars rarely begin because one side actively seeks catastrophe. More often, they begin when miscalculation, mistrust, and escalating signals collide faster than diplomacy can keep pace. Whether today's warning signs ultimately lead to renewed negotiations or a more dangerous phase of confrontation remains uncertain. What is certain is that every move, from diplomatic rhetoric to military deployments and presidential security decisions, will continue to be scrutinized with extraordinary intensity. Because when the stakes involve regional stability, global energy markets, and the military posture of the world's most powerful nations, even the smallest signal can carry strategic significance far beyond its immediate appearance.